In the spring of 2007, zoologist Colin Lawton arrived to survey the forests of Lewis and Offaly and found something strange. Gray squirrels, which had been plentiful here until recently, had almost vanished. Red squirrels had been gone for a long time, but where had the grays gone? Something isn't right here, Lawton told his PhD student. She began searching for the answer and found something far stranger. A predator not seen for decades had returned to these forests, the pine marten, and its return would become part of a large-scale operation that was set to change the fate of British squirrels. In 1911, 12 gray squirrels were brought from Woburn Estate in Bedfordshire to Ireland and gifted at a wedding to a member of the Granard family at Castle Forbes, County Longford. It was a typical Victorian gesture, an exotic animal as entertainment for a country house. Nobody thought about the consequences. Not because they were irresponsible. The concept of invasive species simply did not yet exist. From Castle Forbes, the Greys moved east and north at roughly 2 kilometers per year. Without natural enemies and without significant resistance, they covered most of the eastern half of the island within a few decades. What stopped them was not human action. It was the River Shannon to the west and the lack of suitable forest beyond it. By the mid-20th century, gray squirrels had displaced reds across most of their range in Britain and Ireland. The mechanism is simple. Greys are heavier, eat more, and are resilient on bare trees in winter. They also carry squirrelpox virus, harmless to themselves, but lethal to reds. A red cannot win either in competition for food or in a battle against disease. Wherever gray squirrels appear, reds disappear within a few years. This rule held everywhere, without exception. Almost without exception. In 2007, Ireland's National Parks and Wildlife Service conducted another nationwide squirrel survey. The results looked inexplicable. Greys, which in 2007 were still being recorded in the midland forests of Lewis, Offaly, and neighboring counties, had simply vanished from some areas. Not displaced, not shifted, vanished. Where they had gone, red squirrels were beginning to appear. Red squirrels not seen in these forests for 30 years. Field zoologist Colin Lawton from the National University of Ireland, Galway, told his PhD student Emma Sheehy, "Go and find out what's going on." "We expected that greys might have disappeared from a few forests," Sheehy later said in an interview with Ireland's Wildlife, "but it turned out to involve a very large area." Sheehy went into the field. She set traps, conducted surveys, analyzed scat. What she found did not fit the standard picture. Pine martens, martes marts, had returned to the midland forests. A small mustelid predator, cat-sized, brown, with a cream bib. Until the early 20th century, the pine marten had survived only in the most remote parts of the Scottish Highlands and the west of Ireland. Forests were being felled. Game estates destroyed them as vermin. Furriers hunted them for their pelts. In 1988, the pine marten received full legal protection in Britain. Ireland had protected it earlier, in 1976. After this, its numbers began slowly recovering. The pine marten is an animal almost no one in Britain has ever seen alive. It leads a predominantly nocturnal life, keeps to dense woodland, and avoids open ground. Matthew Davis, a volunteer with the Vincent Wildlife Trust monitoring program in mid-Wales, described it this way. "I spent years looking for martens, and the closest I got was a tail disappearing into the undergrowth. You blink, and it's gone." This invisibility was precisely why its disappearance through the 20th century went almost unnoticed by the wider public. Sheehy cross-referenced the data. The decisive moment came not in a laboratory. She later described how one day in the field she plotted all her observation points on a map. Marten here, gray there, marten here, gray there, and suddenly saw that between the two maps there was no overlap at all. Not a single place where both species existed side by side. It was not a statistical correlation. It was empty space on a map that spoke for itself. Where the marten had returned to the Midlands, greys were absent. Where there was no marten, greys remained. The correlation was so clear it looked almost implausible. In 2014, she published the findings with Lawton in the journal Biodiversity and Conservation. The paper's title, "Population Crash in an Invasive Species Following the Recovery of a Native Predator." The gray squirrel population had collapsed across roughly 9,000 square kilometers of former range. The red squirrel had become a common animal in forests where it had been absent for 30 years. But why specifically the pine marten, when Irish forests are not empty? They contain foxes, hawks, and owls. The answer turned out to be both morphological and evolutionary. The pine marten is the only arboreal predator on the British Isles. It is adapted to pursue prey into the small refuges, drays, that other predators cannot access, explained Joshua Twining of Queen's University Belfast in a 2020 study. Twining and his colleagues analyzed pine marten scat from various parts of Ireland. They searched for DNA traces of both squirrel species. The result? The marten eats gray squirrels significantly more often than reds, and, more importantly, eats them exclusively in spring and summer. Only during the breeding season. In spring and summer, a gray female sits in her dray with her young, and this is precisely when the marten finds her. It enters through the same opening and destroys the litter. Every season, in every accessible nest. The population does not die from direct predation. It stops being able to replace itself. Red squirrels face the same situation, but with a different outcome. The marten eats them too, but far less often. Why less often? The answer came through a separate experiment. In 2020, Twining's team visited 20 forest sites across Northern Ireland. At each, they installed a feeding station and a camera trap. On the entrance to each feeder, they applied pine marten scent, fresh from the predator's nest. A red squirrel approached the feeder and stopped. It sniffed the entrance, raised its tail, and retreated a few steps. Then returned, retreated again. Even as the scent faded, it did not relax. It approached less often, paused for shorter periods, and glanced more frequently at the branches above. A gray squirrel approached the same feeder, sniffed it, and began to eat. No reaction whatsoever. Pine marten scent meant nothing to a gray squirrel, and this is the entire point. The red squirrel evolved alongside the pine marten for millions of years and recognizes that scent at an instinctive level. The gray arrived in Britain in 1876. On an evolutionary timescale, an instant. The results were published in Royal Society Open Science. The mechanism lies not only in direct predation, but in the prey's inability to even recognize the threat. In 2018, Sheehy and a team from the University of Aberdeen and the University of Massachusetts Amherst published a follow-up study in Proceedings of the Royal Society, B. They selected 3 areas of Scotland with different durations of marten recovery, from over 45 years in the Highlands to only a few years in the borders, and set up feeding stations fitted with sticky tape to collect DNA. From the hair, they extracted DNA from individual animals, allowing them to track not simply martens are present in this area, but exactly where specific individuals moved, which territory each held, and how far they ranged. For the first time, researchers were watching not a population, they were watching individual predators and their impact on specific forest patches. This was the same dynamic at 3 different points in time. The result replicated the Irish data. Where martens were present, grays were absent. Where grays were absent, reds were returning. 2 independent studies in 2 countries were giving the same answer. That was enough to move from observation to action. Against this backdrop, the Vincent Wildlife Trust launched Britain's first predator reintroduction project of this scale in 2015. The team caught 20 pine martens on the Morvern Peninsula in Scotland, and each received a veterinary check, a microchip, and a VHF radio collar. The journey to Wales began with a ferry crossing of Corran Ferry, then hundreds of kilometers south to 3 forest sites in mid-Wales. Each animal was placed in a soft-release cage with food similar to its natural diet. A few days of acclimatization and the doors were opened. The selection process was rigorous. Only adults in good physical condition, equal numbers of males and females. Juveniles, injured animals, and the very old were released back at the capture site. A PhD student accompanying the project simultaneously collected fecal samples from animals in the cages to measure cortisol levels, an indicator of stress. The question was simple: how traumatic is the journey itself, and does it affect behavior after release? The results are still being analyzed. 17 of the 20 established themselves in new territories. 3 returned to the cage on the first day. and one female was observed by the team to have eaten both her own portion of food and what had been set out for neighboring martens. Researchers tracked collar signals weekly and mapped routes. Simultaneously, at 6 gray squirrel trapping sites, the team monitored what was happening to gray behavior. The result, grays began moving more, and their daily distances increased. They were not disappearing, at least not immediately, but they had stopped behaving as if they owned the forest. They had started looking over their shoulders. Already in 2016, just months after the first release, the first successful breeding was recorded. Martens that had come from Scotland had raised kittens in Wales. This was earlier than the team had expected. By 2017, a further 31 animals had been transferred, 51 in total. By 2022, the Welsh population was estimated at more than 40 individuals and had spread from the Brecon Beacons to Snowdonia. Local farmers initially did not know what animal had appeared in their forests. They described it as a brown raccoon. The pine marten had been so long forgotten in Wales that people who had spent their entire lives near these forests could not identify it. This is perhaps the most precise illustration of how complete its disappearance had been. In 2019, 18 martens were transferred to the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire. In 2021, a further 17. In October 2024, 15 new animals were brought to Devon. Slowly, site by site, the pine marten is returning to places it has not been seen for 100 years. Now for the numbers. The grey squirrel costs the British economy over £40 million per year through timber losses, reduced carbon capacity of forests, replacement plantings, and bark stripping damage. It strips bark from oak, beech, rowan, and chestnut, particularly trees aged 10 to 40 years. In 2000, the UK Forestry Commission found that 100% of sycamore plantations, 66% of beech, and 30% of oak showed grey squirrel damage. Britain had not stood idle. In 1937, Parliament passed the first official order against grey squirrels. During World War II, they were reframed as a wartime threat, eating grain, damaging timber, and consuming timber that was needed for industry. By 1947, 450 hunting clubs were operating across Britain. They shot 100,000 animals in 2 years. Greys kept spreading. In 1953, a bounty system was introduced, 1 shilling or 2 free cartridges per tail. Over 5 years, Britain submitted 1,520,304 tails. Result: 0. The program was closed in 1958. In the 1960s, warfarin began to be used, the cheapest and most effective method at the time. In September 2014, the EU revoked its license. No alternative was found. In 2015, the organization Red Squirrel Northern England shot 21,000 grey squirrels in northern England, around 60 pounds per animal, more than £1 million for the season. The following year, greys returned from neighboring forests. The grey squirrel breeds faster than humans can trap it. Every local effort is a hole in a sieve. In Ireland, between 2007 and 2019, the grey squirrel's range contracted by 41%. The red squirrel's range grew by 51%. The pine marten's range expanded by 205%. Greys disappeared from 85% of the 100 square kilometer grid cells where both species had coexisted in 2007. By 1900, there were around 3.5 million red squirrels in Britain. Today, around 287,000. In England, reds number somewhere between 15,000 and 39,000. They hold on in a few fortified areas, the Lake District, Northumberland, and the Isle of Wight. Beyond these islands, they are gone, because the space is taken. The pine marten solved part of the problem without a budget. But there are 3 challenges researchers discuss openly. The first is pace. The pine marten reproduces slowly and lives at naturally low densities. In Scotland, it had been well established in the Highlands for 50 years, and only now is it beginning to appear regularly in the borders. The second is forest. Ireland and Britain are among the least forested countries in Europe, 11 and 13% woodland cover respectively. The sphere of influence of the pine marten is largely confined to woodland habitats. Twining wrote in the Journal of Applied Ecology in 2021, "The less forest there is, the slower the marten expands its range. The slower it expands its range, the more time greys have in urban areas without any pressure at all. The third is the city. The pine marten avoids human presence, does not enter parks, and will not tolerate dense development. The grey squirrel is the opposite." Twining's study across 332 sites in Northern Ireland showed that even with full marten recovery, gray squirrels will persist in urban parks and suburbs. And this is the greatest uncertainty in the entire picture. In the quiet of urban islands, free from predator pressure, grays could theoretically develop across a few generations the one thing they currently lack: the ability to recognize a pine marten. The potential for such a scenario to alter the ability of pine martens to control gray squirrels cannot be ignored. Twining wrote, "It has not happened yet, but there is no answer to this question yet, either." In 2026, researchers from the University of Galway Ulster Wildlife and the Vincent Wildlife Trust announced a new All-Ireland survey. It will be the fourth following 2007, 2012, and 2019, and will give a complete picture of how the ranges of all three species have shifted over the past 7 years. In Longford, the very county where 12 squirrels were released in 1911, the local council is calling on residents to record every sighting. Red, gray, pine marten, so that scientists know where the front is, where the shift is happening, where the edges lie. In England, the pine marten stands at the threshold. The Forest of Dean, Wales, Devon, these are the points from which it might theoretically begin moving east and south. But between it and the center of England lie cities, motorways, a fragmented landscape, and millions of gray squirrels that have not been touched for decades. Where the marten already exists, reds are returning. Where there is no marten, the laws of the 19th and 20th centuries still apply. The gray holds the forest. The question is no longer whether the pine marten works as a tool. That has been proven. The question is whether Britain will manage to plant enough forest and move enough martens before urban gray populations have time to adapt. This is a race between two processes, and neither is fully under human control. 12 squirrels, one wedding gift, 115 years. To repair this, nature found a tool. Whether it will reach the places where it is needed most is not a question of biology. It is a question of time and of forests that still need to be planted.